The morning I sat across from Dr. Patel at the Sunnybrook Clinic in Toronto, staring at a printout I didn't fully understand, I kept thinking about my garden. Specifically, I kept thinking about how my roses had been dying for 3 summers straight and how I'd blamed the soil, the weather, the neighborhood cats, everything except the obvious. Sometimes we look so hard for complicated explanations that we completely miss the simple, terrible truth sitting right in front of us. I was 67 years old. I had survived a difficult divorce, raised 2 children mostly on my own, buried my mother, outlasted a recession that took my small accounting practice down to almost nothing before I rebuilt it, and retired comfortably at 63 with a paid-off house in Oakville and enough in my RRSP to live the quiet life I had always promised myself. I was not a fragile woman. I was not the kind of person things happen to. And yet there I was, shaking in a plastic chair while Dr. Patel used words like elevated heavy metals and chronic exposure and we need to run more tests immediately. How long? I asked him. How long has this been in my system? He looked at me carefully the way doctors do when they're calculating how much truth you can hold. Based on what I'm seeing, he said, likely several months, possibly longer. I drove home on the QEW in a kind of fog. It was October, and the lake was gray and flat and enormous beside the highway, and I remember thinking that the world looked exactly the same as it always had, which seemed wrong somehow. Everything should have looked different. Everything had changed. Let me go back to the beginning. My son Daniel married Claire in the summer 3 years ago. It was a beautiful wedding at a vineyard near on the lake, one of those golden late August days where the light does something extraordinary in the late afternoon, and everyone keeps stopping mid-conversation just to look at it. I was genuinely happy. Daniel had dated some difficult women over the years, and Claire seemed different. She was composed, well-spoken, worked in financial planning downtown. She shook my hand at our first meeting and looked me directly in the eyes. And I thought, yes, this one is solid. What I didn't understand then, and what took me far too long to understand, is that composed and trustworthy are not the same thing. Poise can be performed. Warmth can be constructed. And some people are simply very, very good at being whatever the room needs them to be. After the wedding, Daniel and Claire moved into a semi-detached in Mississauga. I stayed in my house in Oakville. My daughter Meredith lived in Vancouver with her husband and my 2 grandchildren, so I didn't see her as often as I would have liked. The arrangement felt natural enough. Daniel would call every Sunday. Claire would text occasionally. Birthday wishes, a photo of a meal she'd cooked, a link to an article she thought I might enjoy. It felt like a real relationship building itself slowly the way real relationships do. Then, in the spring of the following year, Daniel called to tell me that Claire's lease on her office space was ending and she was moving her financial planning practice to a home office. They were thinking about buying a bigger house. Would I consider, and he paused here, careful with his phrasing, would I consider letting them live with me for a few months while they sorted out a new mortgage? The Oakville housing market was brutal, he said. It would just be temporary. I said yes. Of course I said yes. He was my son. They moved in on a Friday in April with a rented van and more boxes than I thought 2 people could own. Claire immediately reorganized my kitchen, which I told myself was helpful. She replaced my coffee maker with one of those expensive pod machines, which I told myself was a gift. She started cooking most evenings, which I told myself was generous. I kept telling myself things, is what I'm saying. The first sign something was wrong with my health came about 6 weeks after they moved in. I woke up one morning feeling as though I hadn't slept at all. Not the ordinary tiredness of age, but a deep cellular exhaustion, as if something had been draining out of me in the night. I chalked it up to the disruption of having people in the house. I'd been alone for 4 years. Of course my sleep was affected, but the tiredness didn't lift. It deepened. By July, I was taking naps in the afternoon, something I had never done in my life. My hands had developed a faint tremor that came and went. I was losing weight without trying. 4 pounds, then 6, then 8. My hair, which had always been thick, was coming out in the brush in quantities that alarmed me. I went to my family doctor in Burlington. She ran blood work, checked my thyroid, ordered a bone density scan. Everything came back within normal range. You're 67, she said, not unkindly. Some of this is just the body changing. I wanted to believe her. It was easier to believe her. By September, I was struggling to get through a full grocery run without sitting down. I had always been an active woman. I walked 40 minutes every morning along the waterfront trail. I did yoga twice a week. I drove myself everywhere without thinking twice. Now I was gripping the cart at the Loblaws on Kerr Street and doing quiet calculations about how many more aisles I had left in me. Claire was attentive during this period. That is the thing I keep returning to, even now. She was so attentive. She brought me tea in the evenings. A chamomile blend she said was good for sleep. She made sure I was eating. When I mentioned I'd had a dizzy spell on the stairs, she suggested I let her know before I went up and down. "Just so someone's aware?" she said, "just to be safe." I thought she was being kind. Daniel noticed I was struggling and seemed genuinely worried in the way that busy people are genuinely worried, meaning he was concerned enough to mention it, but not concerned enough to sit with the concern long enough to ask harder questions. He worked long hours. He trusted his wife to manage the household. That's what I told myself when I thought about why he didn't push harder. I'm still not entirely sure I believe it. The turning point came on a Tuesday in late September. I came downstairs earlier than usual, around 6:30 in the morning, because I'd been awake since 4 and had given up on sleep entirely. Claire didn't hear me on the stairs. She was in the kitchen with her back to the door, and she was doing something at the counter near the kettle. When she heard me come in, she startled, a full-body flinch that she immediately smoothed into a smile, and turned around with my mug of chamomile already in her hand. "You're up early," she said. "Here, I just made this for you." She handed me the tea. I took it. I sat at the kitchen table and drank it, and I thought about that flinch. I am an accountant by training and by instinct. I spent 30 years noticing when numbers didn't add up. I spent 30 years being the person who looked at a set of figures that everyone else accepted and said, "Wait, something here is off." I had let myself stop thinking that way about my own life, because it was easier, because I didn't want to believe what the instinct was telling me. But I had seen that flinch, and I started paying attention the way I used to pay attention when the numbers were wrong. I began to notice that Claire was always the one who made my tea. Not sometimes, always. If I reached for the kettle myself, she appeared within moments to do it for me. "Let me, you should rest." I noticed that she used a particular tin of tea she kept on a specific shelf, separate from the other tea in the cupboard. I noticed that when she poured my cup, she turned slightly away from me, angling her body between me and what she was doing. I noticed that on the mornings I made my own coffee before she came downstairs. I felt marginally better by afternoon. I sat with these observations for 5 days. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself that this was what happened when you watched too many true crime documentaries, which Claire had introduced to the household, now that I thought about it. I told myself that I was an old woman whose mind was searching for explanations for a body that was simply deteriorating. But the accounting mind doesn't stop running the numbers just because you tell it to. On the 6th day, I called my friend Patricia. We've known each other since our children were in elementary school together, and she is the most unshockable person I have ever met. I told her everything: the fatigue, the weight loss, the tremor, the normal blood work, the flinch, the tea. I told her I thought I was going insane. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Dorothy, I want you to come stay with me this weekend, and I want you to see a different doctor. Daniel will think something's wrong." "Something is wrong," she said. "That's the point." I told Daniel and Claire I was visiting Patricia for the weekend for a long overdue catch-up. Claire smiled and said that sounded lovely. Daniel kissed me on the cheek and said to give Patricia his regards. I watched them both very carefully as I said it, and neither of them looked anything other than pleasant. Patricia drove me to a walk-in clinic in Hamilton on the Saturday morning. I told the doctor there that I'd been experiencing neurological symptoms, tremor, fatigue, cognitive fogginess, and that my regular blood work had come back normal, but that I was concerned something was being missed. I asked for a heavy metals panel. She looked at me over her glasses. "What makes you think heavy metals?" "I'm an accountant," I said. "I rule out one thing at a time." She ordered the test. The results came back in 4 days. Patricia called me when she got the call from the clinic, because I had listed her as my contact. I hadn't wanted the results going to my home address. She didn't tell me over the phone. She drove to Oakville, sat down across from me at my kitchen table while Daniel and Claire were both out of the house, and put the printout in front of me. Thallium, not arsenic, not lead, Thallium, a heavy metal that is colorless and odorless and tasteless, that causes hair loss and neurological damage and extreme fatigue, that metabolizes slowly and accumulates over time. And that was sitting in my blood work at a level the clinic's covering physician had flagged as consistent with repeated low-dose ingestion. I sat with that word for a long time. Ingestion. I want to tell you that I immediately called the police. I want to say that I was decisive and clear-headed and I knew exactly what to do. But the truth is that I sat at my kitchen table with my closest friend and I cried for about 20 minutes because it is one thing to suspect something terrible and another thing entirely to have it confirmed on paper. I cried because I was frightened, and because I was angry, and because some part of me was still looking for another explanation. Some benign accident, some innocent reason. My daughter-in-law's fingerprints were all over this. Patricia let me cry. Then she handed me a glass of water she had run herself from my tap, and she said, "What do you need to do right now?" "I need evidence," I said. "I need something more than a blood test." The camera was Patricia's idea, technically. She had installed a small indoor security camera in her own home the previous year after a break-in on her street, and she walked me through the setup on her phone while we sat there. It was a small device, barely larger than a deck of cards, with a wide-angle lens and a motion-activated recording function. We ordered it on Amazon with Patricia's account and had it shipped to her address. She brought it over 2 days later. I set it up on the kitchen shelf behind a row of cookbooks, angled toward the kettle and the counter where the tea tin sat. The lens was barely visible if you knew it was there. If you didn't know, it was invisible. Then I waited. And I did not touch the chamomile tin. I let Claire make my tea. I poured it down the sink when she wasn't looking, rinsing my mug and returning it to the drying rack so it looked used. This was the hardest part. Not the waiting, but the performance. Sitting across from her at dinner and talking about the weather and the neighborhood and whether the city was going to fix the pothole on our street while holding this knowledge inside me like something radioactive. I checked the camera footage each morning when Claire was in her home office and Daniel had left for work. For the first 3 days, nothing. Claire made tea normally, and I was so certain in those moments that I had been wrong, that the thallium had come from somewhere else. From old pipes or a contaminated supplement, or some industrial exposure I'd had years ago and never thought about. On the 4th day, I watched her open the cabinet under the sink. She kept a small zippered pouch there, behind the cleaning supplies. I had never noticed it. She unzipped it, removed a small glass vial with a dropper top, walked to the kettle, and added several drops to my mug before adding the tea bag and the hot water. I watched this 47-second clip 11 times before I called Patricia. I want to talk for a moment about what it feels like to watch something like that. People always want to know. Friends, later, the detective who handled the case, even the Crown prosecutor. They all wanted to know what it felt like in that moment. I think they expected me to say rage or devastation or some cinematic emotion that made sense of the situation. What I actually felt was very quiet, a kind of settling. The way you feel when you've been doing a calculation for hours and you finally find the error and everything suddenly resolves. Not happy exactly, but finished. True. I called Patricia. Then I called my daughter Meredith in Vancouver, who did not take the news quietly. Then I saved the footage to a USB drive and to Patricia's email and to my own cloud backup, because I am an accountant and I understand the importance of redundant copies. Then I called the Halton Regional Police non-emergency line and asked to speak to someone about a suspected poisoning. The detective who came to Patricia's house, I asked them to meet me there, not at my home, was a woman named Sergeant Lawson, and she was methodical in a way I found deeply comforting. She watched the footage twice. She asked me careful questions. She took my blood test results and the camera and the USB drive. She did not tell me I was overreacting or that there could be another explanation. "I need you to not go back to the house tonight," she said. "My son lives there." She met my eyes. "I understand, but right now I need you to stay somewhere else." I stayed at Patricia's. It was a Wednesday night. I lay in her guest room and looked at the ceiling and thought about my roses and about Daniel and about all the Sundays on the phone where I described my symptoms and he'd said, "Mom, you need to rest more," and whether that had been innocent or something else entirely. And I made myself stop thinking about it because I didn't have evidence, only fear, and I was done acting on fear. The police executed a search warrant on my house on Thursday morning. I was not there. Patricia drove me to a Tim Hortons on Spears Road, and we drank coffee and said very little for about 2 hours, and then Sergeant Lawson called. They had found the vial under the sink. They had found a second one in Claire's home office. They had found, on Claire's laptop, a series of searches going back 14 months. Searches about inheritance law in Ontario, about how long it takes thallium to cause organ failure, about the difference between a will and a beneficiary designation, about what happens to a jointly held property when one spouse dies. 14 months. She had been planning this for 14 months before she even moved into my house. They arrested her at 9:40 in the morning. Daniel was at work. He came home to Sergeant Lawson and 2 other officers in a house that had been turned inside out, and apparently he sat down on the front step and didn't move for a long time. Patricia told me later that a neighbor had seen him. I don't know how he looked. I couldn't ask him yet. The conversation with Daniel happened 4 days later at Patricia's kitchen table, because I was not ready to be in my own home. He came alone. He looked like he had aged significantly in 4 days, which I suppose we both had. He told me he hadn't known. He said it 4 times, and then he stopped saying it because he understood that the number of times he said it didn't change anything. I believed him, mostly. I believe him more now than I did then. But I also know that he hadn't pushed hard enough when I was sick, that he had accepted the easy explanations, that he had loved his wife more completely than he had been paying attention to his mother, and those things are true alongside his innocence. We are still working through what our relationship is on the other side of this. It is slower work than I expected. I think I expected that the truth coming out would make everything clean again, the way a good audit clears the books. It doesn't work that way with people. Claire's case went through the Ontario Court of Justice. The Crown charged her with administering a noxious substance with intent to endanger life, which under the Criminal Code of Canada carries a maximum sentence of 14 years. They also charged her with criminal harassment and fraud over $5,000 because the financial planning practice she was running from my home had been used to access information about my accounts. At the sentencing hearing, Claire's lawyer argued that she had been under extreme financial stress, that the marriage was struggling, that she had not intended to kill me, only to make me ill enough that I would revise my estate planning in Daniel's favor and eventually move into a care facility. The judge was not moved by the framing. She was sentenced to 9 years. 9 years. I sat in the courtroom and heard that number and felt nothing for a moment, and then felt everything, and then felt nothing again. That is the only way I can describe it. I have been back in my house in Oakville for almost a year now. Meredith flew out from Vancouver for 2 weeks after the arrest and helped me repaint the kitchen, which I needed to do. We took out the pod coffee machine and the chamomile tin and a shelf of cookbooks I found I could no longer look at. We planted new roses in the front garden, a variety called Morden Sunrise, which is bred for Canadian winters and is, according to the nursery, extremely difficult to kill. My health has improved substantially. Thallium clears from the body over time with proper treatment, and my neurologist at St. Joseph's in Hamilton tells me that my blood work is now within normal range. The tremor is largely gone. I walk the waterfront trail again most mornings, not as fast as I used to, but I'm out there. I want to say something to anyone watching this who is older, who is living with family, who has been explaining away symptoms that don't make sense. I want to say this as clearly as I can. Your instincts are data. When something feels wrong, that feeling is information. The fact that the person making you feel that way is someone you love, someone you trusted, someone who has smiled at you across a dinner table for years. That doesn't make the feeling wrong. It makes it harder to act on. Those are different things. I am also aware that what I did, setting up a camera, going to a different clinic, building a paper trail before going to police, required resources and support that not everyone has. I had Patricia. I had a retirement income that didn't depend on Daniel or Claire. I had enough background in documentation to know what I needed to collect. Not everyone has those things, and I think about that. If you are in a situation that doesn't feel safe, the Senior Safety Line in Ontario is available around the clock, and they handle calls in multiple languages. You do not need to have proof before you call. You just need to call. My son Daniel is in individual therapy now. We have dinner together once a month, just the 2 of us, at a restaurant we both like in Burlington. We talk about neutral things mostly. His work, my grandchildren's school performances that Meredith sends me videos of, a biography I'm reading, a hockey game he watched. We are building something. I don't know yet what shape it will take. I changed my will 6 months ago. I also changed the locks, updated my beneficiary designations, and set up an independent financial trustee through a firm in Oakville that has no connection to my family. It is a lot of administrative work, and I say that without bitterness. It is simply what it costs now, the overhead of having been taught this particular lesson. I still make my own tea. Every morning, I fill the kettle myself, and I choose my own tin from the shelf, and I wait for the water to boil. It is a small thing. It matters to me more than I can properly explain. I survived. I am still here. I plan to be here for a long time yet. And if anyone or anything tries to argue with that plan, they are going to find that I have become, if anything, a great deal more difficult to get rid of than I used to be. If this story reached you today, please share it with someone you love who is older. Not because the world is full of Claires. It isn't. But because awareness is the cheapest form of protection there is, and none of us should have to learn that the hard way. Thank you for being here. Please take care of the people in your life, and please let them take care of themselves. There is something I have come to understand about the way consequences work, not as punishment handed down from somewhere above, but as the simple, mechanical result of choices made over time. Claire made a series of choices. Each one followed from the last with a kind of cold logic, and the outcome, when it finally arrived, was not random. It was the precise shape of everything she had done. That is worth sitting with, I think. When I look back at those months in my own kitchen, the exhaustion, the tremor, the hair coming out in the brush, what strikes me now is not the cruelty of what was happening, though it was cruel. What strikes me is how long I explained it away, how readily I accepted the comfortable story over the true one. There is a kind of courage required to look clearly at what is in front of you, especially when what is in front of you is someone you have chosen to trust. I did not find that courage quickly. I found it slowly, and only because something in me, the part that had spent 30 years looking at numbers that didn't add up, refused to fully go quiet. That stubbornness was not a virtue I cultivated deliberately. It was simply what remained when everything else had been worn down, and I think that is often how resilience actually works. It is not the grand decision to be strong. It is the smaller, quieter refusal to stop asking the question that doesn't have a satisfying answer yet. What I did was not remarkable in any dramatic sense. I called a friend. I went to a different clinic. I ordered a small camera and pointed it at a shelf. These are ordinary actions. The intelligence they required was not brilliance. It was the willingness to trust my own observations over the more comfortable narrative being offered to me. That is a form of integrity, believing what you have actually seen, even when believing it costs you something. The ethical dimension of this story does not belong only to Claire. It belongs to all of us who witnessed something and chose the easier interpretation. Daniel chose comfort over clarity for too long. I chose politeness over instinct for longer than I should have. The people around us who don't ask hard questions are not villains, but their silence has weight, and that weight lands somewhere. What I want to leave you with is this: the qualities that kept me here. The willingness to observe carefully, to act on what I found, to build a case before I made an accusation, to ask for help without shame. None of those came from a single dramatic moment of decision. They were habits, slowly built, occasionally forgotten, but never entirely gone. You build those habits in the ordinary days, long before you need them. Tend to them. They will matter more than you expect.